Hello, everyone. It's great to see you. It's great to see a great turnout tonight. My name is Woody Bernhard, and I'm very proud to host this meeting with all of you people to talk about democracy. I'm pleased to welcome Nick Biddle tonight. The subject of his talk is Democrats and Democracy After Trump, something I've been wondering about myself. And so I'm looking forward to hearing what Nick has to say. Nick has lived in Brattleboro since 2013, and he was at one time co-owner of Artrageous on Elliott Street, and he is a retired professor of Latin American history. So I'm pleased to welcome Nick back to the Brattleboro Democracy Forum. So Nick.
Is that me?
I'm looking forward to hearing what you have to say.
All right. Today's talk, Democrats and democracy after Trump. And the closer we've gotten to the impeachment, the closer all these events that are taking place, I have to say that I'm going to speak a lot about Trump himself today and Trump's impact, because it's still with us. And I'm kind of concerned about how much it is and will be with us. I was honestly, aside from the violence, I mean, I don't like the deaths and the injuries that occurred on the 6th of January, but I am very glad for the 6th of January because it demonstrated to the world the extreme of Trump's neo-fascism. And there's a playbook to fascism, and Trump used it. You start by projecting a fabled past. You promise to bring that past back. You identify an enemy that is the destroyer of that past. You make sure that enemy is racially or ethnically distinct other. And then you galvanize your constituency to follow you to attack the enemy and bring back the magical past. And Trump did all that. And I've read the word a couple times, and I like saying it. January 6th was the apotheosis of Trumpsterism. And on that morning, he stood in front of a crowd of about 8,000 people, at least 99% of them white people. And he said these words: just remember this, you're stronger, you're smarter, you've got more going on than anybody. They try and demean everybody having to do with us. And you're the real people. You're the people that built this nation. You're not the people that tore down our nation. They demean us. You're the real people. They're not. Who are the they? Well, we remember all too well, of course, from the start of his campaign. It's the rapist Mexicans, the murderous Muslims. African Americans are always part of the enemy. They got more so in last summer after George Floyd's murder. And so the irony of Trump calling, that white population the real people and demeaning implicitly African Americans, immigrants, people of color. Historically speaking, we all know that America was built by African Americans and immigrants. And there we were on January 6th watching 8,000 white people ready to destroy and tear down the Capitol. And, and boy, they tried. They really did. The utility of fascism from the leaders of fascism is that it galvanizes a social movement that frequently acts against its own interests and unwittingly in favor of elite interests. Organic social movements, and let's think about the labor movement, the civil rights movement, the women's movement, LGBTQ movement. Those are organic movements always carry within them a redistributive set of demands. But fascism is conjured up, managed and maneuvered to generate an identifiable real people in Trumpian terms, who are then pitted against the others. And opposition, demonization, theoretical and material violence are encouraged among followers. And those things substitute for the programmatic policy changes that would possibly bring back that magical past in reality. And so remember, the fascist leader makes huge amounts of promises and then defers and discards them as time goes on. 2016, what was Trump going to do? Repopulate the Midwest, the Rust Belt, with industrial jobs, 7 million of them, zilch. Disastrous Obamacare, toss it right out. He promised universal health care, a whole new program, and he assured us in 2016, and the government is going to pay for it. Not a chance. A $1 trillion infrastructure reinvestment program involving hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of jobs, never saw the light of day. And did his followers complain? No. Instead, they ramped up their blaming, their theoretical violence. And along came QAnon in October 2017, soon after the Charlottesville riot, I think not uncoincidentally. In 2017, October, this website pops up, QAnon, and whoever QAnon is, whatever individual or set of individuals, they purported to identify a secret cabal of satanic worshiping, cannibalistic pedophiles running a global sex child trafficking ring and plotting against Donald Trump. Moreover, the cannibalistic ringleaders were Democrats in Congress, Hollywood actors, and high-ranking members of the national security state, or deep staters. Now, what a glorious enemy. Who wouldn't want to go after such sickos? The real trick is believing they exist. And so with QAnon came the Twitter circuit boards, just boom, 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 bots proliferating, and an alternate right or an alt-right echo chamber emerged, built on the shoulders of alt-right, right-wing radio in the model of Rush Limbaugh, Michael Savage, Glenn Beck. Outrage and defamation exploded through the airwaves, analog and digital. As a closed circuit media environment congealed, inventions of fact and fiction intensified. Now, a certain level of absurdity, once reached and accepted, appears to affect an individual who accepts such levels of absurdity, much in the way of the metaphor of Caesar crossing the Rubicon. That once one goes across that line, that river of absurdity, one can never really go back. And this is essentially the borderline of cultness. Federal prosecutors identify QAnon as a cult. Most critics of Trump characterize his relationship to his base as cult-like. I'm pretty amazed at the ability of the echo chamber to entrap its audience, but it does. It would be excellent, I think, if the Democrats were able to reinvoke the fairness doctrine that the FCC put into place in 1949 and took away in 1987, a doctrine that obliges every media outlet to do two things. One, not to speak untruths knowingly or falsehoods or lies knowingly. Two, whenever presenting an issue, to present both sides. If that actually existed in our media world, all sides would be more civilized. And I know that's, an idea in the Democratic hopper, but it's a small idea compared to the larger issues at hand. I think the biggest question that America faces is how to authentically improve race relations. How will this society confront, identify, and resolve its systemic structures of racism? When we peel away the layers of rationale for the Capitol attack, the mob invasion, stop the steal, right? The false narratives purporting to explain the steal, African Americans in Detroit, Philadelphia, and Atlanta voting and voting often, using the registrations of dead people, their relatives presumably, or tens of thousands of communist Democrats in Arizona and Minnesota who are using and duplicating mail-in ballots and filling them in falsely and fraudulently and submitting them. That is the big lie that stole the election from Trump. And who are the culprits? Why, it's again these other people of color, the African Americans, etc. In the week after January 6th, leading into the second impeachment in the House and the week after, Trump and his allies created this equivalence between the invasion of the Capitol and Black Lives Matter marches, saying that, the incidental property damage and some little violence here and there of millions of organized marchers protesting the cold-blooded murder of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and literally innumerable other African-American citizens by white police, that protesting those murders was somehow equivalent to to the Capitol invasion, to what happened in the invasion of the Capitol. Well, it would be preposterous, except that it was floated in the media so often that on January 19th, here's a letter to the editors of the Los Angeles Times from a resident of Long Beach, California, the title of which is "Stop Comparing the Capitol Mob to Black Lives Matter Protests." And the last line of that letter, I think, is spot on. It is. To compare the unlawful conduct of a handful among thousands of conscientious Black Lives Matter marchers with an organized mob bent on seizing the Congress of the United States and disrupting a constitutionally mandated process is, well, fake news. And there it is, the moniker that started it all, fake news. How many times did Trump utter those two words? And when he said them, the mainstream press stayed quiet. When Trump insulted the New York Times by calling it fake news, the New York Times stayed quiet. Why? Well, for one, Trump is great press. And when Trump insults the New York Times, he's making money for the New York Times by increasing its readership. And two, essentially all sentient beings in America and elsewhere have to agree that most of the words that come out of politicians in Washington, most of the words, promises, and deeds are a set of lies. How about the unnecessary war in Iraq, the weapons of mass destruction? How about Obama's promised to close Guantanamo Bay. He said that in 2007, still running. How about the Paris Climate Accord? America hasn't done a thing. So we're accustomed as American citizens to lies, half-truths, and obfuscations as the basic content of American political rhetoric. And referencing that, pointing to that, is perhaps the only actual truth that Trump ever referred to. And it is the kernel of truth upon which fake news stood. Trump used the cynicism of Americans relative to the lies of politicians to open a chasm of distrust and disbelief wider than the Grand Canyon, into which Steve Bannon, QAnon, and Confederates constructed the echo chamber. Inside that chamber, Trump repeated a dialogue of loss, grievance, and victimization. They tore down the nation. We're going to take it back. And how are we going to do it? By fighting like hell. Well, now it's over. Trump is in Mar-a-Lago, facing a trial in the Senate next week. We can thank his consistency. Just Saturday, he fired his latest rounds of lawyers because they wouldn't perpetuate the big lie as his defense. But we know he's not going away. 2 weeks after January 6th, an NBC poll showed 87% of Republican voters continuing to believe the big lie. Disarming and diffusing the collective anger, delusion, and pride that spur these Republicans and the Capitol mob is no easy task. And unfortunately, we sit here dependent upon the Democratic Party to do that. And thankfully, an outlier or two in the Republican Party, prominently Mitt Romney. On the 26th of January, last Tuesday, Mitt participated in a forum, a Zoom forum hosted by the University of Chicago, during which he said that he would implore his fellow Republican lawmakers to go on Fox TV and say, I was a Trump supporter, but he lost fair and square. Subsequently to that, in response to the questions of reporters about the newfound interest the Republicans seem to have in unity, Romney went on to say, I say to my fellow Republicans, first of all, have you gone out publicly and said that there was not widespread voter fraud and that Joe Biden is the legitimate president of the United States? If you said that, then I'm happy to listen to you talk about other things that might inflame anger and divisiveness. Well, I say right on, Mitt. But first things first. Will the impeachment do the trick? Will it blow the bubble? We understand that as the press says, that the House managers are arming a very emotional case to present next week. And anybody who read the New York Times today saw a very elaborate and extensive story outlining the 77 days between the election and the inauguration, during which, quote, this is front page, the line from the Times, a lie former President Trump had been grooming for years overwhelmed the Republican Party. And that, let's emphasize that word, overwhelm. Alarmed national security advisors, political scientists, and journalists are generating recommendations, and I see them as identifying two major factors in need of resolution. The first is somehow or other popping the bubble of belief in the big lie. And while Romney's solution would be good for senators and Congress people to stand up and say it was a lie, that's to say that the election theft was a lie. would be good, but I just don't see Republicans doing it. I mean, right now, even Mitch McConnell is kind of silent, and Liz Cheney is under frontal attack. Republicans in the main remain captured in the Trump cult, and Democrats play along. They agreed to shorten the impeachment trial to 3 weeks, which would be normal, to 1 week. And then they're considering substituting a motion of censure for the impeachment itself. Here, the Democrats show their incessant weakness, a pattern developed for decades to eschew fighting for the people in the interest of balancing the budget, reining in Medicare, and generally subscribing to the 1990s Clinton mantra, "It's the economy, stupid." Well, Democratic support for the economy over the last 30 years has resulted in the devastation of unions, massive cuts to the social safety net, and deference to corporate profit over environmental regulation. In short, long ago, the Democratic Party left the people and sided with money. Now, as Democrats ponder replacing impeachment with censure, and as I'm speaking, Biden is talking to Republican senators about weakening the $1.9 trillion COVID relief bill to a $600 billion bill. That's a cut of more than 2/3. Now that this is happening, we can justly be afraid that the Democrats will once again display, as the journalist Ezra Klein elegantly wrote a week ago, their preference for the false peace of decorum to the true progress of democracy. Democrats have a spine to grow, and we the people have to help them with that. But I'd like to wrap up my comments by focusing on the second very vital factor in need of resolution, again returning to the big lie and its consequences. Two recent articles by high-level counterinsurgency and counterintelligence veterans, both deep staters in Trump's parlance, warn that the makings of a right-wing violent insurgency is out there in the land, reinforced by the still bamboozled, fitful, and in many cases genuinely aggrieved majority of the Republican Party. They warn that the Proud Boys, 3%ers, and Promise Keepers showed full capability for violence on January 6th, and that those men are, and their female counterparts, to however degree there are out there now lying in wait. The danger as they see it, in line with the more straightforward political thinking, is that these racist, avowedly fascist militia will sabotage vaccine distribution, short circuit vaccine freezers, blockade inoculation sites, as happened briefly in California yesterday, as well as more aggressively blow up municipal buildings, destroy transportation infrastructure, and other similar actions with the intent to increase dysfunction, fear, and alarm nationwide. If such crimes do occur in connection with supine democratic pleas for bipartisanship, the doors will open for Republican majorities in both the Senate and the House in 2022. And that in turn may herald the return of Trump or the rise of an even more authoritarian Republican. I think it's extremely important to remember that when on January 6th, after the riot, 138 representatives in the House, Republicans, and 7 senators continued to challenge the election and the electors. And that by doing that, what they demonstrated was the deep will within the Republican Party to actually simply destroy, get rid of, toss out democracy. In the short time ahead, a failure of Democrats to work for the people, to stand up against Republican chicanery, if punctuated especially by insurgent disruption in day-to-day American life, as these deep staters, whose names are Robert Grenier and Malcolm Nance, are afraid, a door to real authoritarianism will open up. But they have two suggestions for us, recommendations. The first is to isolate and alienate the committed insurgents from the population. The second is to inflict shame on the militants and to sow doubt among the followers. Clearly, we're too early in the post-Trump period to know what direction things are going to take. But no matter what happens, I have a suggestion for the Democrats in Congress and for ourselves here in the streets. Trump built his, so far, comparatively short political career on a foundation of fake news. And I think Democrats need an equally catchy marketing phrase. And I've turned my marketing eye towards finding something similarly cheeky, condescending, and dismissive as fake news. And I've come up with zany conspiracists. They're all zany conspiracists. So when folks in your world surprisingly mutter support for the big lie or for Trump, I say, roll your eyes slightly, move your hand, and say, oh, you zany conspiracist. I recommend the Democrats in Congress, every time a Republican refuses to admit the big lie, that the Democrat point to that individual, go, zany conspiracist. My bet, unfortunately, is that Trump will dodge impeachment for a second time, which will heavily embolden him and his followers. I deeply hope I'm wrong. Even if he is impeached, then his minions will turn to avenging their martyred leader. Trump is here for a while. We must find a way to isolate and alienate his constituents from the militants among them. And we must find a way to shame the militants and sow doubt among the constituents. Zany conspiracists, all of them. And with that, I'll close. Thank you.
Nick. Thanks for the presentation. A lot to consider here. What you have done, excuse me, in my view, is what Lewis Powell did in 1971 in trying to outline a long-term game plan for the spineless Democrats. It's a tall order. At least ever since the neoliberalism of Clinton, who I like to finger as being one of the people most instrumental in destroying the New Deal coalition. And the goal, I think implicitly in what you're saying, is that we should at least get back to that, where you have a support for unions, real support for civil rights, real support for minority rights in general, that we have, that the Democrats have abandoned. So it's a long-term strategy. And although I do like your zany conspiracists, obviously, you're doing this in kind of a facetious way, but obviously we all know it's going to take a lot more than that. So
Indeed. Yeah. Should we open it up?
sure.
Yeah. Who would like to say or ask anything?
I would.
Please do, Kier.
Thanks for that really clear outline of the fascist playbook. That was terrific. And my question is about your opinion about whether modern day social media platforms could perhaps be held to something akin to the FCC fairness doctrine. I mean, is there a way, because the way in which people fall into their own echo chambers and don't come out is what's so alarming. And it has little to do with their levels of education, you know, or their access to real news, right? That's not the issue. But so to help, you know, counter this terrible delusion, I'm wondering, do you see any hope in something like a kind of accountability on the part of social media platforms?
Well, my answer would be kind of in line with what Tim said. This is kind of a long strategy. A fairness doctrine on mainstream media would, at the very least, require Fox News and MSNBC to show both sides of the issue. That would diffuse both sides. It would start to create the knowledge or the social awareness that, hey, that's possible. That, you know, showing both sides, you know, does diffuse partisanship of information. And while, you know, Steve Bannon will continue to rally forward because he's who he is, he will have to confront, you know, an actual social march towards a greater fairness. So I wouldn't expect, you know, a silver bullet, but I do think that it's a really important component of a long strategy.
Can I jump in? 1997, there was a deregulation law passed, and I'm damned if I can remember the exact name of it, and maybe some of you out there can help me, that said, and thanks to Clinton again, or at least he supported it, that these social platforms are not responsible for what goes on them because they aren't a publisher, they're only a platform. And therefore Congress said, you do not have responsibility, internet. Although we're seeing an attempt now to rein that in. And I don't like the idea that we're allowing the corporate owners of these media to be the gatekeepers. That's absurd. It should be us, the people. It should be Congress determining what that is, not the whim of somebody, Bezos or whoever the hell it is. That is an absurdity. End of rant.
More.
Yeah, I'll pick up on that. This is Marley from Proctorsville, Vermont. Thank you for the invitation, Nick. This is a lovely talk. The question, a lot of questions are interesting me, but the question that just came up is, what is social media? Is it media? Can it be held to this hypothetical modern day FCC Fairness Act? Is it a modern day town square? Is it a private company that users can use and determine what goes on it? The quote that was just said was, us, the people, we the people should determine what's on it. But I think some of these corporate owners would say the very same thing, that the people who use it should determine what's on it and we shouldn't censor them. It's a thorny topic, one that will come out more, but Kirsten also brought up the fact that social media contributes to people's own echo chambers, regardless of where you are on the political spectrum and your own beliefs. So we're in a new age that has these new forms of media or modern day town squares or town greens where you can voice your opinion. And maybe new regulation is needed, and maybe even if new regulation were enacted, other forms would crop up because it's human nature to form these echo chambers. I don't know. I'd like to believe what Nick says, that if the media were held to account now and Fox News and MSNBC had to present both sides, it would provide an example to the people. But I'm not sure. So I don't know. I guess I'll just leave it there for a moment and see what others might have to say to that.
I don't want to keep jumping in with other people.
Stephen, what do you think about social media and its how does one distinguish it from mainstream media, and is it a sort of administratable, entity?
Yeah, I mean, I think Marley brings up a really good point about the question of trying to define it. I think that Fairness Act, I was going to ask you to comment on that a little bit as well, because it comes from an era or sort of the end of an era where media was a fairly constrained concept. And now we've got these vehicles for mass communication that are completely democratized in the sense that anybody can contribute to them. It's no longer Walter Cronkite is the only person who has the microphone. We all have the microphone now. And how in the heck we're going to manage this is mind-boggling. The three of us discussed that New York Times article last week, pointing out that Zuckerberg, there's a small group of people who are tasked with defining how Facebook is going to go about sort of monitoring, controlling, censoring information that is shared. It's a small group of people who Mark Zuckerberg personally appointed and pays a large amount of money. We have had no input on it, as Tim just said. This completely being dominated and controlled by, dictated by one person who has power that's unimaginable. So I guess I'm just trying to amplify Marley's sort of message, which is this is extremely complicated, complex, and we are unprepared for this. And I don't know how to scale up our thinking to be able to manage it.
The history of the First Amendment in this country, obviously, has always been a can of scorpions. One of the most difficult aspects of this right is how nebulous it is. And the courts have really never paid much attention to it to the turn of the last century, with Oliver Wendell Holmes and the like, and having to do with protests around the World War I. And then it emerges again in the last 20 years. But the technology is racing so much faster than our historical or our legal concepts can travel, that it is Marley is correct. It is an extraordinarily difficult, vexing problem that I don't see any future immediate nostrums or solutions right now.
I could say something. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, good. These things don't always work. That was a great, crystal clear presentation, Nick. Thank you. And I'm going to jump in on this social media rant a little bit, because there's another aspect that I haven't heard yet mentioned, which is the algorithms. So you all probably know that maybe 60+% of Americans get all of their news from Facebook and Google, right? And that news that they get from Facebook and Google is curated, the word they use, meaning it's selected from the millions of articles and bits floating around. And what it's selected for is to make us enraged at the other, because that's what gets people going to Facebook and Google. So this is, it's more than micro-targeting. It's more than tiny little newspapers, for example, aimed at a sewing club in Des Moines, Iowa, trying to get them to think something's happening, which exists, as you know. It's also poisoning our minds by giving us a reflection of our own worst paranoia every day, all day, 24 hours a day. And we wonder how people buy into the QAnon nonsense. Had to stop myself there. That's how, obviously, they fall down a rat hole and suddenly all they see is that. So I think it has to go, whatever solution is devised, if one is devised, has to go beyond making people tell the truth. It has to go to the heart of this business model that enrages us at each other and polarizes us to make more money. As I think it was a guy, the head of CBS, was it Moonves, when Trump was first elected, said,
Yep.
Trump may be disaster for America and for democracy, but he's tremendous for CBS. This is it's a business model. It's not just a falling apart. So that's all I'll say. And good luck with this one. It's terribly difficult, as you guys keep saying.
What I see the Democrats as being able to do, if they hold the line with the COVID relief bill, and the next week will be a very interesting week around the Trump impeachment. But my favorite initial action that they think, that they say they might do is something that they're calling the For the People Act, which will be a voting rights expansion and safeguard act to prevent the voter suppression that Republicans are so heavily engaged in wherever they get to throughout the nation. And it's interesting to me how under discussed this particular act is at this point. And I'm kind of just asking, is anybody else familiar with it?
Just in general terms, that's all I'm familiar with.
Yeah, right. So, I mean, if we wanted to get right down to being practical about Democrats and democracy, then we should start getting in touch with Bernie and our representative to, what's this For the People Act sort of thing. I mean, I haven't heard much about it aside from what I've read in a couple articles.
How many state legislatures are still controlled by Republican parties? Do we know?
I off the top of my head, I'm not gonna. No, I don't. I know it's more than half.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's going to be a key element too, because they're the ones that write the rules.
Right. Yeah.
And especially since the Civil Rights, the Voting Rights Act of '65 has been eviscerated.
Right. Right, which is part, I think, of what the For the People Act is trying to overcome.
Right. Yeah.
And if it's a really big act, it'll take on campaign finance as well.
Yeah.
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 And those are the issues that is for the people, so to speak, versus for the money. Not to mention, of course, all the climate legislation that is for the world, for the earth, and all of which will, confront the Wall Street, the Republicans, the corporations, and is going to be the real test of whether Democrats are ready to cut their ties to money in favor for the people.
Point of information, there are 32 state legislatures where both houses are Republican.
32. Woo. Yeah. Yeah. And you look at it in terms of, so we just had this monumental election in one of the most unstable times in modern history. And the people didn't turn away from the Republicans. Hell, we almost lost the House and didn't make any real, we made some gains in the Senate, did make some, obviously the Democrats won the presidency. But in 1932, during the beginnings of it's more of the peak, one of the peak times of the Depression, Herbert Hoover was absolutely slaughtered. He was wiped out. People were so pissed, they voted for a very vague platform of platitudes by Franklin Roosevelt. And we didn't experience that just recently. The thought would be that with the pandemic and the economic problems and the racism and such, that people would be ready for some real change. I don't think they voted for real significant change, and that's to me is a conundrum.
Well, I think that speaks to the power of the echo chamber and everything that we've been talking about relative to social media and the technology and so apart, that looks like the main focus as we're sitting here thinking about what to really address.
There's a question for everybody. If we had Democratic leaders sitting on this Zoom right now, what would you tell them? Keeping it clean, of course.
Somebody who hasn't spoken, please say something.
Well, I would say something, if I'm not muted. I think I would say, you were saying about Roosevelt, he was elected on a bunch of platitudes. But I think that, if I'm not mistaken, those platitudes were a change from the previous circumstances, and he offered people an alternative to what they had experienced, which was a very bad experience, but was basically oriented towards taking care of people, giving people an ability to survive, eat dinner, etc. And I think if the Democrats offered something real to the people of this country, that they would make more progress. I think the Democrats are too timid, too cautious, and too afraid to take real stands. They're not Bernie Sanders, but I think if Bernie Sanders were making these proposals, that Democrats and the country would fare much better.
I think part of the problem is that it seems to me that ideology now outweighs policy.
Mhm.
So people are not thinking about COVID relief or thinking about employment. They are thinking about pedophiles and maybe the people who aren't quite that radical into QAnon are concerned just with us and them. And so, policy seems to have fallen by the wayside.
There's another angle I'd like to just put out there, and that is that we seem to have lost the ability to talk about what's right and what's wrong, what's moral and what isn't moral, what's good and what is bad. And I think that has, I guess that's part of the media's inclination to not take sides, to be objective, so-called objective. But I feel a real lack in our population of an understanding of what is right and what is wrong, and what we should be doing with life in the sense that maybe we should be working for good instead of bad, and right instead of wrong. I just wanted to put that out there. Hi.
Hi, I'm Ellen. I agree with you, Woody. Thank you for calling this. Thank you. Nicholas, wonderful, very well done. And you had me, my friend Mary said, you had me at the Black Lives Matter was the most important thing. The original flaw in the Constitution was, the original lie was that, that it was the slave trade, the people that were brought here who used their ingenuity and knowledge to make money for, buy cotton and all that stuff. So that's in the news now. There's wonderful best-selling books, and white people are talking about them in book clubs about caste and so on. But the politicians, including our dear Bernie, don't want to touch that. They can't just, except for Joe Biden in the way he says, okay, I will have I can work for a black guy as a president. I'll have a black woman vice president. I mean, that's a nice visual, but it takes, I just don't want to see again, as it happened in the civil rights movement too. Suddenly, the Vietnam War wasn't racist, it was imperialist. And so white people could really get behind it instead of fighting with, remaining with the radical, dangerous, scary Black Panthers, et cetera. Even after Black Lives Matter, we can go back to Netflix, we can go back to something else for a while. But that was the biggest interracial movement. And to make that political, I'm not a strategic thinker. I don't have that at all, but I do believe that we have, especially in my generation, which is called the baby boom, about to pass from the scene, but not without leaving a legacy. And so being able to support young Black people and structures, land trusts, housing trusts, community banks, businesses, things that are already there that you don't have to, and not talking about it. That's spiritually very important, but that also is strategically very important, that you don't put your efforts out there in the public so that they can be manipulated or stolen or whatever. So it's, in a way, I don't know how to dismantle Amazon, Google, et cetera, but I do know that the post office still works, the phone still works, word of mouth in my circles still works, that people meeting each other and forming mutual aid, even across the country, it's very, I don't know what to, anyway, it's old fashioned, shall we say. But it's more important than ever. I mean, and again, Black people have always found ways to strengthen their families, their ties, their faith, and their ability to survive. So, and we've found a lot of ways to ignore them. So if we can just, break that barrier, then that's where my hope is. And I was really glad to see you tonight. Thank you for bringing us together too.
I have found much of what is said tonight to contain a lot of good observations and some truths. And I think the idea expressed by Woody about perhaps conducting life or having life structured so that what we all do is good. And there's something that I keep finding myself thinking about in that often life simply isn't fair. Often there are people placed in better or higher positions or more highly paid positions than others for reasons that sometimes cannot be deciphered logically. And we hear, as the environment referred to as the echo chamber. And I find myself, as I'm watching the news and participating in things like this discussion, asking myself, where does the responsibility really lie? Do we look at other things and blame other things, or do we take responsibility for ourselves and looking at what is it that in life appears to be true, literally true and confirmed in various ways, whether it be going to the Supreme Court website and finding what was really decided about that election in Pennsylvania or whatever. Where do we take and what do we require of ourselves to take responsibility for confirming and evaluating what it is we hear, that we read, so that we are able to, I think, make good contributors to maintaining the integrity and honesty of the society in which we live, so that it's essentially probably the most true sense of a groundswell, or the getting back to the basics of our society. Our schools, do they emphasize that, don't accept what you hear or what you read? I remember back I was in school in the 50s and 60s. And, back then there was a statement, I can't remember what it said: read only a certain percentage of what you read, believe only a certain percentage of what you hear. And of that, there's only a certain percent that's actually true. And I think I look at my life and whatever I do, yeah, people will say some things about other people, but my primary source for me is to, when I encounter that person, look at what I find them to be myself, as opposed to what I might heard or been tainted or flavored, whether it be personality, politics, or whatever. And I'm kind of thinking that what do we do about it is a question that was offered several times this evening. And I almost sense that there's a need for ourselves to remind the communities in which we live and our nation in which we live, hopefully around the world as well, that we really need to be paying attention to the facts. The science concept that Biden has been emphasizing, I find very, very refreshing. The fact that his approval rating for his actions just in the last week has increased 10%, from 60 some odd to 70 some odd percent. I think if he keeps it up as a means of maybe getting out of this solution, will allow enough people to see the concept of trying to find the truth, trying to find what's real, and not paying attention to what someone might say, whether they're truly democratic or a fascist or whatever. There's a burden, I think, and an onus on each of us to, I think, practice and function in a manner that I think promulgates the true intent of the society we have. As Nicholas was talking earlier, and I read a little bit about you. You're, I guess, versed pretty well in Latin American countries or South America. And I look at all the turmoil that's happened over the decades down there: Argentina, Venezuela, Peru, some of the other countries. Are the cultures in which those people live, given that there's so much fighting, is there a reverberation of falsities down there, or are they having their arguments and insurrections based on accurate, full principle? There only being a difference in principle, as opposed to one side operating in a false scenario and another side in a truthful scenario, which seems to be where we are as a country, as opposed to maybe what other places in the world are like. I'd be interested in your observations on that.
Well, I'll see if I can keep that under 400,000 minutes. But no, my thought would be to say, first of all, Latin Americans don't live in the complexity of electronic society, and they haven't ever, that we, in the last 20 or so years. So they still live on a very much more direct informational basis, much like you would, the woman who your name would suggest. That they find themselves the victims primarily of violence that they themselves cannot wield, and they have to endure, very much like African Americans in the United States, and that therefore the turmoils of Latin America have more to do with upper class folks struggling for power between themselves and using everybody below as fodder, as they have to do with principles or ideology or moral ethics.
Interesting.
You did it.
Interesting. So are we going toward that in it, looking at the money involved
That's
in
what
our politics?
authoritarianism does. That's exactly right. That's exactly what's happening. And that's what fascism does too. And we've just experienced proto-fascism for these last 4 years. And the January 6th was a moment of witnessing, as much as Trump could hey, Jeffrey, as much as Trump could get together, and it became violent and people died, but it was, the irony or the strangeness of it is that everybody walked out of the damn Capitol. 5 hours into occupation, everybody was escorted out, and there were 14 arrests. On that day, 14 damn arrests through all of the mayhem. Well, what is that about? That's an indication of the kind of what I just said. It's sort of about the upper power seekers fighting among themselves. This is about white people fighting about themselves, and everybody else just has to pay the price. And the Democrats claim that they are for all of us. That's the basis of their ideological stance. Well, they've got right now. They have their opportunity. This is the moment. We have 18, 20 months to fight like mad and make something happen, or or say goodbye.
I have another question, Nick. I'm curious about what explains the corporations who recently decided not to give any money to candidates who denied the electoral college results. Is that because consumers are putting pressure on those companies? I mean, how is that coming about? Because to Woody's point and Ellen's point, the people who are appalled by Trumpism are in the majority in this country, have always been in the majority. I mean, he got an egregious number of people to sign on, right? Egregious that 87% of Republicans still believe the big lie. It's awful. And yet they have always been in the minority. So what are good people to do? And explain to me how it happened that big corporations who famously care only for their own profits have taken that step. Love to hear your thoughts.
I'll answer the second question first, which is that's a propaganda ploy. That's a marketing tool on their part. And you're nodding, that. And almost immediately after that those statements were made, within a day, 2 days, maybe no more than 3, there were numbers of sort of left-wing journalists, not even left-wing, Democratic journalists, liberal journalists, pointing out the limitations that had been, built into those claims and how short-term those would be. To the second question, or the first question, rather. Well, we all have our resources. We all have our limitations. We all know in our hearts what we think is good and what should be better. And we do live in America, and that's why we're talking about democracy, where we do get to use our resources to the degree that we have will to engage in social and political activity to make the world a better place, our little lives. We in Vermont get the great honor of being represented by Bernie Sanders, and we get to the honor of knowing that he's homegrown, even though he's from Brooklyn. He's homegrown within Vermont after 50 years pretty much, and that is possible. So there are still these little inroads into a more of a national, if we want to look at it, impact. But hell, we're all just trying to get by the pandemic and make and find a little justice along the way. And so the fellow who talked about how we all make our own decisions, and I agree with him. I mean, we don't have much more than that unless you're a billionaire, and I don't think any of us are. At which point you get to walk into the theater and start buying politicians and then affecting all the changes that would influence to your degree. So
How about power in numbers somehow though?
Say again?
Somehow. Power in numbers.
power in numbers. And so when the movements come, and Black Lives Matters is the movement that I see among us, within us, up, here, and it's correlated directly to voting suppression and getting rid of voting suppression. And that, I think, is maybe the most important action we can as voters take at this moment in time, is to keep pressing for the end, or some end around, I guess, if not the end, of voter suppression. And maybe this thing that the Democrats are calling For the People Act is what we're looking to really try to get behind. And I don't have enough details to say so one way or the other. But Stacey Abrams is somebody we all want to know more about, and we're kind of waiting. We are in this really immediate moment around Trump and his impeachment, and getting the 1.9 trillion COVID bill passed, which, if it passes the way if it passes, it'll only pass because Bernie Sanders is head of the Senate Budget Committee, and he will do it through the what's it called, Tim? It's called the reconciliation process, which I love, the irony of the concept, reconciliation, which means that we can do it without a 60 vote threshold. It can be 51 to 49 or to 50 even. But if that happens, and that'll be a week or so from now, as will the Trump impeachment, immediately after that, then I think that moving towards expanding the establishment of voting rights and suppressing the suppression of voting rights is the primary political step that we can begin to take.
Well, I'd just like to say that I've really enjoyed this discussion. And I don't want it to wrap up, but there's been some great talk. I just wanted to share a couple of things that have come into my mind since January 6th. And one of them is the idea that what saved us from a coup in Washington, D.C. on the 6th was the American people. A lot more people could have been in D.C. And Trump called on everyone that he could scrounge up. And he had to look in some very dark places to find them. But the majority of American people did not go to D.C. to take over the government. They stayed home. They wanted a democracy. And that makes me really happy to live in this country. The majority of the people are the backbone of this country, and they saved us. Well, I just wanted to say that.
Could I say something
Also-
about voting rights? When we think of voting rights, a lot of people think of empowering the Democrats to win. And we might look at what Stacey Abrams did in that context, but I would suggest there's another way to look at it, which is that for most of my life, since Johnson, I guess, the Democratic Party has completely ignored poor people, and they've pretty much ignored middle-class people, except for what Bannon called the coastal elites, right? So in other words, they shape their policies for their electorate, and they shape their electorate to reflect their policies. If we got everybody in this country registered, which is my fantasy, what the hell is voter registration anyway, right? But a poll tax put in by Massachusetts, where I live, to keep European immigrants from voting a long time ago. If we reshape that electorate by registering more people, either by going out into communities and registering people, or by changing the law so they're registered, that's going to dramatically change the Democratic Party's constituency, and they will have to listen to poor people for the first time. That's an entirely different agenda than the agenda that obviously a large portion of the country finds so repulsive that they turn towards Trump. So enough said, I think.
Cool.
I also believe that it's imperative that people from Puerto Rico and people from DC get
Yeah.
the right to vote for a representative and senators. And it just so happens that those are all people of color. 700,000 people in DC don't have the right to elect a senator or a representative. And Wyoming and Vermont have less population than DC does.
And that's another part of the For the People bill. You know, so that's what Ezra Klein was talking about, exactly those points.
I really appreciate Garrett's comment. It just, this light bulb went off in my head about the absurdity of voter registration. Like, I hadn't really thought about it in this way, but like the idea that there would somehow be an influx of foreigners that could influence our election just before election time because they weren't really allowed to vote is absurd. Who would they be? Canadians? Like, you know, people from Mexico are not going to stream into our country and affect the vote. So basically, if you're here, you ought to get to vote. Because that's 99% of those people are eligible, you know, appropriate voters. Let's just do away with that.
Well, should we all vote on your point?
Only those who are the right kind of voters.
Show your Zoom registration, please.
Yes, all right. Much work to be done as usual, but we have to keep on doing what we're doing.
Yep.
So,
And I you know, I thank all of us who are here tonight for getting together on this evening. What I think we've established is that we don't really know where to move right yet. How to step forward at this point. We have real questions about media and social media. We're not really clear about what the Democrats have in mind for the next 18 months, but we are clear that whatever they think they're going to do, they better do it. And so we know, if we're concerned citizens, we know that that's true. And so now it's time to find out what they got on their agenda and see if we can get behind it or what we can and cannot get behind.
Seems to me, and as we're all expressing our thoughts, there's probably a need for more communication and advising our legislators, both state and federal, of what it is that's on our mind. That there are issues that need attention. There are issues that a degree of honesty and integrity that's expected of them, and to I think maybe reinforce their will and thinking to let them know that the people where they're representing, the state they represent, the community they represent, is asking things of them that perhaps they need to be more vocal about. It's been disappointing to me to see that not much has come out of our state in terms of the criticisms, the observations that could have been made about Mr. Trump. And I have started to communicate some of that to the three of them by email. And I've gone out of state and, when it's appropriate, endorsed AOC on some things that she said and others. And I get a good feeling out of that. I often get a response to it. The sad part, talking about money, is that within 2-3 weeks after that contact is made by me, I get a solicitation for money, a donation. It's like, can't you just take it at face value for the good of society and the good of the people in the country as a whole and all the components that it has, instead of resorting to money, money, money? That's what I need. It's depressing in that aspect of it, but it's good on the other end. At least I got it off my chest, and I think grassroots probably is, as it always been said, the way to go, the way to start, to make that movement and that wave grow bigger. I thank you very much for setting this up. I really appreciated the feelings and expressions and thoughts everyone's offered. Thank you.
No, I think a few historical models should be recognized. One would be the populist movement, the end of the 19th century into the 20th. The coalition, of course, that was built around the New Deal, and the excitement of the progressive movement around Bernie Sanders, but also around Black Lives Matter. Those are models that we can use. And I think the answers are there. We don't have to reinvent things. They're there. It's just a matter of us putting it into motion in a sustained way.
Yeah.
And I think we can. Or we'll die trying.
There you go. That's right.
So, my name's Mary. I'm from Brattleboro, and this has been a very, I've really gotten a lot out of just being here and listening to everyone. And, it's echoed, not sorry to use the word, but echoed a lot of my feelings and thoughts about the circumstances right now. And I think that it would be helpful. I mean, I've really appreciated this. And if other forums like this could be presented, I think it would be beneficial.
Yeah, I think Woody, you're doing a lot of this, aren't you? You did a couple up in Marlboro, I think, at one point before COVID. And then I think last month you had some kind of get together of sorts. Are you the person that's kind of behind all this?
Yeah, you can blame Woody.
Yeah, well, I'm really happy to do this, and I really enjoy doing it. I haven't done things in Marlboro for, I think, a couple months, but I'm planning to get back on track with it. Yeah, it's wonderful to talk with all of you. I think we may be at an ending point right now. I'm not sure. I don't want to shut anybody off, but if anybody has last words that you want to say, I liked Tim's summation there. We have a lot to do, but we're going to keep trying. We're going to keep working on it.
Yeah.
So thank you all very much for coming. I just have a few things to say to close the meeting. As I already said, thank you. Great to talk to you. I want to thank Stephen Vinoy and Andy Reichsman for helping us with the tech stuff involved in this. And also thank you to WVEW, who will air this show on the radio on next Sunday at 3 p.m. And also to BCTV, who will be posting this video on their station. So I'm really delighted about that. I'm delighted that more people will see this. And so I think that's it. Thanks so much for coming. It's great to see you. Great to talk to you. Keep up the good work.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you, Nick.
Absolutely. Thanks so much.